Hello and welcome back to the channel, and today is the 19th of November 2024, which means that Blender 4.3 is released. I'm not going to be talking about all the features that released. A lot of YouTubers already do that, so you can just watch their video. Instead, I have something that I am really passionate about. So the thing I am talking about is gizmo nodes. So let's just open up Blender 4.3 and open up a new scene. So here we are in Blender 4.3. We can just delete the default cube, add in a plane, then go over to the geometry nodes editor, add in a new geometry node setup, and just zoom in a little bit. So let's search for one of the gizmo nodes. So we have the choice of a dial, a linear, and a transform gizmo. And I'll just add all of them in here. And here they are. And if I select one of them, you will see some things appearing in the viewport, which will be the gizmos that we are going to be working with. The first thing you might notice is that they do not appear if you don't select the node. So to change that, we can select one of these gizmo buttons to make them visible all the time without having to actually select them. So you can toggle that on and off for whatever you want, but for now I'm just going to turn them off. Another thing you might notice is these inputs here. These values kind of have a capsule shape instead of like the round shape you would normally see in inputs like this. And this is basically like a dual input. I have no idea what they're actually called, but yeah, it's just a value, but it goes both ways. So if you go into the geometry, we can just drag off this value. So when we go over to the group input and we drag this value in here, the value will appear and you will see these double lines appearing, which will be that dual value. So usually you would go over to the modifiers and then have your geometry nodes here and you can change the value. What we can do now is also change the value with this dial. As you can see, if I rotate this dial, the value goes up and I can dial it down and dial it up. But I can also change this value and yeah, just change the dial. But right now that is not visible in the dial that is actually rotating. So we need to actually change some of the properties here. So for these gizmos, you have a position for all of them. And then for the dial, you have the up direction. And then for the linear, you just have the direction. And then for the transform gizmo, you have the rotation. These values influence nothing but their respective gizmos. So you can change the position of them and kind of have an offset based on the value. So let's use the linear gizmo as an example. So here we have a linear gizmo. We can drag it up and down and you will see the value reflect that here. It will always snap back to like the origin. What if we actually want to set the position of this plane? We can do it like this and then just use this value as the combine XYZ for the Z value. And now this will be moved up 7 meters. Let's just reset this to 0. So changing this value will move the plane up. Then we can also change that with the gizmo here. And it moves quite well with the plane. If we let go of this, the gizmo will just snap back to the origin. So to fix that, we can just use this same combine XYZ and then just set that to the position. And now this gizmo will always follow where the plane is. And we can also change that with the value. So now you will actually be able to see that the value affects the gizmo as well. So what's basically happening is if we play with this gizmo, it sends an update from this node all the way over to this value here, and it updates the value. But if we update the value, it will send over an update to the gizmo that will update the value as well. If we hover over this value, you can also see the exact float amount, which will be equal to the value in your modifier panel. So as you can imagine, you can make really cool tools with this. So I've been working on my own as well in the beta, and we're just going to take a look at that now. All right, so this is my procedural light setup, and I have all of these geometry node tools that we will take a look at. All right, so let's start with the backdrop here. And as you can see, I have gizmos that you can just pull and change every property that you want with it. This also works in rendered view, so you never actually have to go to the modifier panel. You can just change everything here, and I really like that about this new update. By the way, if you want this will be available on my Gumroad, so I'll leave a link in the description and you can get it there. But yeah, it's really cool to play around with. Something like this curtain, you can just make it wider and make it taller, and then change like the endpoint of this and change how high it is, change how wide it stands. You can change pretty much anything about it just on the fly. This makes it much more accessible for beginners that want to start getting into geometry nodes or like using some geometry nodes. Sometimes geometry nodes have really complicated setups that you have to know about. I feel like this will really help with that. And one of the good things about this is that it's backwards compatible as well. So versions before 4.3 also just still work with the same geometry node setup. So it's not like you're making something for 4.3 and up. You're making something for 4.3 that works better in 4.3, but it will still work in 4.2. So as an example, we'll look at this in 4.2. All right, so this is the exact same file, and you will see file written in Blender 4.3 or newer, but we're just going to ignore that. As you will see, the gizmos have completely disappeared. They're not here because, of course, these aren't available in 4.2. But I can still just go into the modifiers and change anything about this because it's still just using values. So it doesn't really matter which version you're in. If we go over to the geometry nodes editor and just open this up, you will see this geometry node setup, and you will see these undefined nodes, which will be the gizmos that I actually use. It's really cool that Blender has made it so that nodes from future versions are undefined in previous versions. Alright, so let's make a tool of our own. Okay, so I have to stop myself here. I was going to explain to you how to make your own tool of this with rotation, location, and scaling, but I did it in the wrong order. So I did the location first, but if you then scale it, it will scale from the origin and it will just look really weird. So I'm just going to do it again, and I'll post this on my Patreon so you can download it, look at it, see what I did. All right, and then we're just going to add in an object. Doesn't really matter what. We are just going to add in a cube for now, so we can work with the cube. So open up a new geometry nodes editor, add in a new geometry node setup, zoom in a little bit, and this is where we are going to add in our gizmos. So the correct order to do this in would be to scale this first, then you can do rotation, and then you can do location. We are going to be doing location based on the vertices, so the origin will always stay at the world origin, or wherever you place the object, and we want to rotate it from the place that it's moved to, so we should do the rotation before the actual location part. I'll show you in 3D. So what we want to do is we want to scale, then move. So yeah, it's just normal, but what I did in the previous recording, that's why I have to re-record this, was basically just move the vertices up and then scale from here. And you can see that this is not really intuitive, so that's why we have to do it again. But of course I cut it out of the video so you can just look at me doing it properly now. Alright, so in the geometry nodes editor, let's add in a gizmo, and let's do a linear gizmo for the scaling. So in here, we can just click this icon to make it visible always. We can set this to a box, which will be the scaling icon that is default in Blender's gizmos. You can see that if you go over to the scaling menu here, they have the boxes. We can just bring this value in here, and when we move this, the value will increase here, and then it will just snap back when we release. So we need to match this to the scaling of our cube. So add in a scale elements node, just place it in between here, and here we can change the scaling. So give that this value, set the value to 1 by default, and then if we just play with this, it will scale up and down, which is what we would expect. All right, so now we can scale up, then we can scale down. But I want this gizmo to snap to the absolute top of my cube always, or the top of the object, whatever you're doing. So to do that, we need to do a little bit of math with the bounding box, just to be sure that we have the correct place. So once we've scaled this up, the cube is a little bit bigger, so we need to just drag out of this and search for the bounding box. This will give us a minimum and a maximum, and we can also preview the bounding box, but because this is a cube, this will just be the cube. If I rotate this, however, and then apply the rotation, the bounding box will be bigger and not square anymore because the cube is inside. All right, let's reset all of that. So what we can do with this min and max, that will just give us the bottom values and then the top values. And then we can subtract those and get the absolute maximum that our bounding box is. So we can place our gizmo on there. So just do a vector math node in between this. Set the minimum to the bottom value and the maximum to the top. And then set this to subtract, and then with a separate XYZ, and then we can just get the Z value. Then combine this again because we need a vector input, and then just place that into the gizmo on the position. And this will now be twice as big as our cube, so we need to divide this as well. So add in a math node, and you can either multiply by 0.5 or divide by 2, doesn't really matter. I do multiply because it's easier, because the default value is 0.5, but yeah, you can also just put in 2 and then divide. It does the same thing. All right, so this will now move with our cube, which is really cool. And this is the scaling part. It's really simple. So we can clean up the node graph a little bit more. The cool thing about this is that the gizmos are completely separate from what you're actually doing to the object. So here we have our scale, and the only thing we need the scaling for is for the location of the gizmo But in reality, that doesn't matter at all. That's just a cosmetic thing we need to worry about. So yeah, overall the gizmos are separate from your normal geometry nodes, so it's really easy to implement them into already existing ones, or to just keep them separate and work really cleanly in new projects. Alright, so that is nice and cleaned up. So now let's do the rotation. So for this we can add in a dial gizmo, which gives us this nice dial that we can change the rotation with. There's also a transform gizmo, and that basically does like everything a transform gizmo, and it basically does everything that we're going to do in here, but it's really clunky to work with. And this is basically just to kind of show you how this works. So that's why we're going to do this all separately. But yeah, just know there's a transform gizmo. I already talked about it, but yeah. Alright, so the dial gizmo will be the rotation. So we just drag the value to the value here, and then we need a transform geometry, and then the rotation, so a combine XYZ. So we only change the Z rotation here, like that, and then just drag in a value to the Z, and now we can rotate our cube really nicely. It's so easy. I'm really happy with these new nodes. Alright, and that's it for the rotating logic. Now we just need the logic for the gizmo. And just thinking about it now, there is really no logic to this. This is already perfect. So we can just continue on with the location. So add in a either a transform geometry, or you can do a set position, whatever you want. In theory, you can do this all in the same transform geometry node right here. But for the explanation part, I think it's good to do this separately, and then you can figure out how to merge them all together later on your own. So yeah, we're going to keep it separate, but just know this is not the only way. You can do this in a lot of ways. So let's add in a linear gizmo again. And I want this to move up, but it's kind of conflicting with the colors. So I'm going to set the color to the Z color, just so we know that we are going to be moving the cube up with this. Again, just drag out the value and then put it into the group input here. Then get this value and put it into a combine XYZ and just the Z value. And we want to plug this into the translation like that. Now when we drag on this, it will move up. And now we need to make sure that our gizmo moves with our cube as well. And the same location we're going to be applying to the dial and the scale. Because of course, when our location moves, they need to move up as well. But it's really easy to implement. So yeah, with our gizmo here, we need to just use the same exact value as the position that we just changed. So we can just drag in the combine XYZ, and now when we move up, it moves with our cube. And then we can do the same thing for our dial gizmo, and that will also move up. But for our scale, we need to add this onto our existing Z coordinate. So just add in a vector math right here, set to add, and then just add these two together. And now they will move nicely with our cube. And the scaling will be exactly like we expect it to be. If you find it annoying that your scale gizmo gets in the way of the location gizmo, we can also set it to a different axis. So if you go to the linear gizmo with the box, we can set this to, for example, the x-axis, which will be red, and set the direction to x1 and z0, so it's pointing the other way. And now we just need to switch these values around a little bit. So set this to the x, and that will be very nice. We can do everything we want with it. One extra problem we have is a really small one, and that's because now we can actually rotate. So first we only had the scale, but now we can actually rotate, so the scaling isn't correct anymore. To fix that, just use the geometry of the transform geometry for the bounding box instead, which will make it correct. And that's basically our tool. It's really simple, but I hope that learns you the basics and what you can do with this. So you can rotate, move it up, and scale, and have the gizmos in the correct location. So yeah, that was it. If you learned something, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.
Why on earth would you do something like that? Explain yourself, little cat. I had the heart to mend.